if you think that what you've been dealing with is a kind of an aggrieved great power that can somehow be mollified, or if you're thinking that this is all a result of a botched process of NATO expansion, then there's a path back to some kind of reasonable relationship with Russia. For what it's worth, my view is this is not triggered by NATO expansion. In fact, when Vladimir Putin says, well, he doesn't really care about Finland and Sweden, first, I think he's lying, but quite apart from that, it tells you that NATO expansion is not the issue. I think the issue was democratic contamination and the threat that Ukraine posed to the Russian regime, but also secondarily, and I think this is at a deeper level, this kind of hyper-nationalist ideology and basically the rejection of the settlement of the late 1980s, which involved the breakup of not the Soviet Union, but really the former Russian Empire. And I think there are a lot of people in the leadership who just don't accept that.
In retrospect, you can see some of the ingredients that went into Putin's decision. First of all, I think what happened was what is going on essentially is a preventive strike. Basically, Putin must have concluded that time was not working for Russia. Indeed, time was working for Ukraine. Somewhere from the late 2010s, Ukraine was getting stronger militarily, bolder politically, and more systematically supported by the West. The diplomatic instruments, such as the Minsk process, the Normandy group, turned out to be absolutely non-performing. France and Germany, that were the guarantors of both the process and the group, essentially displayed their utter powerlessness in Kiev. They were not listened to by the Ukrainian leadership that only orientated itself toward the United States. While the United States was getting more active and more in military terms, various military drills in Ukraine with Ukrainians in the area, the Black Sea, and all that. Some of U.S.'s NATO allies were probing Russian defenses off Crimea. You would recall that a British destroyer sailed into the territorial waters off Crimea, just provoking the Russians, which did not amuse Mr. Putin. I think that Mr. Putin and the Russian intelligence saw a considerable demonstration effect in Ukraine of the Second Karabakh War, in which the originally weaker party, Azerbaijan, with the help of a major outside player, Turkey, managed to overturn the Armenian defenses in Karabakh, something that a lot of people had thought would be unlikely before it happened. The direct dialogue with President Zelensky in Kiev, which looked promising at the end of 2019 and early in 2020, was blocked as a result of the intervention of the ultra-rightist and the virulently anti-Russian elements within the Ukrainian body politic. And maybe the last straw, maybe not, but this certainly illustrated the trend. The loose remark given by Zelensky in Munich at the security conference in February, just a few days before Putin made his decision, or at least gave an order, his loose talk about Ukraine revising its non-nuclear status. And that, I think, may have been the last straw. There's another thing. Putin is is turning 70 in October this year. And actually 5 out of the 6 waves of NATO enlargement so far, depending on how you count them, but the vast majority of the NATO moves to enlarge toward Russia happened on Putin's watch. The Russian president must have been painfully aware of his own responsibility. And I have an impression that he decided not to leave that issue, the Ukraine problem, to his successors, so that the Ukraine thing had to be resolved while Putin was in the Kremlin on his watch. I don't think that initially there was a global agenda attached to that. I think it was more about Ukraine, more about Eastern Europe and the security situation in Ukraine. You would recall his demands, the ultimatum, some people call them, that was issued in mid-December. And that included a number of demands with regard to Ukraine: no NATO in Ukraine, no Ukraine in NATO. But it also included NATO's dismantlement of its military infrastructure in the eastern states that had been built over the previous 25 years. And I think this is still on the agenda, but I don't think that initially, this may be different today, but initially this was not something that had a global element to the agenda. Thwarting the US dominated global order, or doing something beyond Europe and Ukraine.
It's interesting, I think, that the Russian government tried to frame this really not as a Russia-Ukraine crisis, but a Russia-NATO crisis. And you had President Putin and others talking about NATO's aggressive expansion to Russia's borders. I don't think that framing really bears serious scrutiny. First of all, if you go back to 1997, before NATO invited anybody to join the alliance, NATO concluded an agreement, the Founding Act on NATO-Russia relations. And NATO tried to make enlargement pain-free for Russian military terms. So NATO in 1997 said, there is no intention, no plan, no reason for NATO to put nuclear weapons on the territory of new members. The message being there's going to be enlargement would not mean NATO nuclear weapons coming closer to Russian borders. Moreover, NATO said that there would be no permanent stationing of substantial combat forces on the territory of new member states. And in fact, until 2014, there were no NATO combat forces permanently stationed or even deployed on a temporary basis for a significant amount of time in the Baltic states or Poland or Romania. It was only after Russia's seizure of Crimea and the Russian involvement in the war in Donbass, or the conflict in Donbass, that you begin to see NATO deploying small multinational battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland. You're talking 1,000 to 1,500 troops each. Another reason, though, is today 5 NATO members border NATO, set aside Finland, which is just in the entry process. Of those 5 countries that border either Russia or the Kaliningrad exclave, the last of them to join NATO joined in 2004. So if this is about NATO's expansion to Russia's border, why have we waited 18 years? And I would also note that in 2002, President Putin was in Rome in May of 2002. He met with NATO leaders, a NATO-Russia summit, and signed an agreement to deepen and give a new quality to NATO-Russia relations. Mr. Putin did that in May of 2002, knowing full well that NATO leaders were going to meet that fall and invite additional countries to join the alliance, including quite probably the Baltic states. So again, enlargement didn't seem to be a problem then. And I think it's one that, again, it's been raised now simply as another grievance to justify what I consider an unjustifiable war against Ukraine. Last point I would make is the Russians know full well that for the last 8, 10, 12 years, there has been no enthusiasm within NATO for putting Ukraine on a membership track, particularly since 2014, because that raises the question, If you bring Ukraine into NATO, say today, is NATO then obligated to go to war against Russia tomorrow under Article 5, which says an attack against one is an attack against all? And you now have, even before February 24, you had Russian troops occupying Ukrainian territory. And I think both Russian diplomats and Russian intelligence services were very clear on that. So I think, just set aside this NATO concern, it's a secondary issue. I really do think there are three factors that drove the Russian policy, the Russian decision to go to war against Ukraine. One is geopolitical, more broadly, a concern in the Kremlin, which would like to have Ukraine in a Russian sphere of influence. They'd like to have that sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and a concern that Ukraine was moving out of that sphere, perhaps irretrievably. And that's probably true. The irony here, though, is nothing has done more than Russian policy of the last 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, Russian involvement in Donbass, to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. I mean, if you go back 10 years to 2012, and you did a poll in Ukraine saying, what percentage of the population believes Ukraine should join NATO? The numbers would be maybe 10%, 15% maximum. There wasn't much interest in that. Today, polls show over 60%, and one that came out earlier this week said 73% of Ukrainians now want to see their country in NATO because they believe that that's essential for Ukraine's security. So if the geopolitical goal of the Kremlin has been to bring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, it's been a massive fail. A second factor, which I believe is also very important here, is about Russian domestic politics. And that is, for the Kremlin, a democratic, Western-oriented, economically successful Ukraine is a nightmare, because that kind of Ukraine is going to ask Russians to, would lead Russians to ask, why can't we in Russia have the same political rights, the same political voice, the same democracy that they have in Ukraine? And for the Kremlin, job number one is regime survival. They don't want that. And then the third point comes back very much to Vladimir Putin and his distorted, and I think most historians would disagree with the history of Ukraine that Mr. Putin presented a year ago in his long essay or in the speech he gave on February 21. But you have in Mr. Putin somebody who fundamentally denies the right for Ukraine to exist as a sovereign and independent state. He has a concept of a historical Russia, of which Ukraine, or most of Ukraine, is a part. And I think you really saw him strip off and said the quiet part out loud a couple of weeks ago, where he implicitly compared himself to Peter the Great and talked about gathering back Russian lands. Let me make the point that this war is a war of choice by Mr. Putin. Ukraine posed no military threat to Russia. 3 points. The Russian military, in terms of active duty personnel, was 4 times larger than the Ukrainian military on February 1st of this year. Moreover, if you go back and look at the last 10, 15 years, Russia spent at a minimum 10 times as much per year on defense as Ukraine did. And over the last decade, Russia has modernized most of its military ground equipment. Whereas if you look at Ukraine, and Ukraine is fighting, and you set aside the Western weapons that are now coming in, but Ukraine was fighting mostly with Soviet era legacy equipment. And then third, Russia today has 4,400 nuclear warheads. Ukraine has 0. As I already mentioned, Ukraine gave those up back in the early 1990s, in large part based on assurances from Russia that Vladimir Putin has now completely ignored.